So the Richard Report on Small Business was a report that I wrote as the chairman of a task force that was convened by the Conservative Party to look at how effective small business support was being delivered in the UK under the current government. And the sole requirement I put on chairing the task force was that we were entitled to be independent and I could choose my own task force. And the net result was, possibly to the delight of the Conservatives, but much to my dismay, was that I found really quite quantitatively and thoroughly that the quantity and quality of business support in the UK, at least as of the time of the writing of the report, was abysmal. And that is the nicest thing I can say about it. It is huge quantities of money lost to no purpose. And in fact, even more perversely, the net result of the money spent by the current government over the last 10 years has been to create an industry of people in the industry of business support. So it's the small business support industry, which is now, of course, wants to stay alive and wants to feed itself. And thus we have managed to create yet another non-productive element of society that in its absence, nobody would mourn its passing. Shortly after I reported that the government had created 3,000 programs supported by 2,000 organizations during its tenure, that they were going to simplify this to 100 programs. And what was fascinating about it is they knew how many programs they were going to end up with before they had figured out which ones worked. Now, you gotta love a conclusion you can start with before you know how to get there. What happens if there had been 110 good programs? What were we going to do? I mean, there's so many places for sarcasm here, you'd weep if you weren't laughing. And, not surprisingly, after a few million more pounds were spent on their business support simplification program, they didn't reduce it from 3,000 to 100, they simply came up with 100 categories. So they came up with yet another layer. If it weren't real, you couldn't make it up. So School for Startups is essentially a business I've started whose sole goal is to teach anybody who wants to be an entrepreneur how to be successful at starting and growing a business. And some of the courses I'm writing are for people who have not yet started a business, and some are for people who have a business that started and are trying to figure out, how do I get this thing to grow? They all have one thing in common. It's entrepreneurial. This is not for mature, established, large businesses. This is for small, hungry, growing businesses or for aspiring entrepreneurs. To date, I've taught 1,200 people since I started, and I'm on track to teach another 5,000 this year. We have a curricula, such as it is, of 5 one-day courses. The first day is entitled The 6 Rules for Startups, and it is just that. I believe there are, when you pare it all down, 6 things you have to do right. If you do those things right, the odds of success improve enormously. And the problem, of course, is I can tell you what they are and it means nothing. You have to know the rule, understand it, and understand how people can manage to fail at it even though they think it's utterly simple. It comes down to a series of analyses you have to do, and you can do them in very sophisticated ways. My goal is to teach people how do you do that, and do it in a one-day boot camp very affordably for everyone. And it's not just for high-tech web entrepreneurs. If you want to start a plumbing business, come to my seminar. I'll teach you how to start the best damn plumbing business in history. In the case of Library House, it's just reassuring to know that I never like to make a mistake just once. I like to really make that mistake a couple of times to make sure it's a proper mistake. And in that case, I've done it before and I'm sure I'll do it again. I started the business with conflicted goals, and those conflicted goals haunted the business during its entire lifetime. It was both a bully pulpit, as Teddy Roosevelt used to say, a fantastic method to have an impact on the world, and it was also supposed to be a profit-making business. And sometimes it went and did one, and sometimes it did the other. I mean, the proximate cause of its death was very simple. It was overly reliant on investment banks as its customers, and the investment banks turned out not to be such good customers in the autumn of 2008. But I do think, in fairness and in honesty, the business would have survived, even not necessarily prospered, because it would have been a tough environment, but would have survived had we been a more ruthless business in the first place and not been so interested in being a political influencer as well. In the instance of Trutap, we ran a transparent business, and so I stood up in front of the company once every couple of weeks and said, here's where we stand. So everyone knew everything all the time. And in fact, Trutap survived. It didn't close, and it's got a very good likelihood. I mean, the service is still on, it's still growing. Most of the staff have moved on to other jobs, but the thing that people don't get is they worry if you tell people bad news, they'll run. When in fact, my experience has been, is if everyone knows everything all the time, they actually stay, from my point of view, far longer than is in their own rational self-interest. And Trutap was a perfect case of it, a fantastically bright, fantastically talented group of people that stayed on as long as they humanly possibly could, even though all of them had jobs, could have jobs waiting for them at any moment, frequently, inevitably, at a higher salary than we could offer them. And so I think it's a testimony to the fact that we underestimate the people we work with regularly. I think that there's certainly a difference. I mean, if you start with the truth, there's a difference. Failure does not weigh as heavily on either your reputation or your conscience in California as it does here. Having said that, even in the 8 years I've been here, I do think there's a shift here. And I think it tends to be a generational one, in the sense that the older generation has not changed their views one whit, and the younger generations has not obtained that view as much. Thus, when I talk to the younger generation of entrepreneurs, they're much more sanguine about the potential for failure, and I think it's because they see around them the world failing regularly and things that were not supposed to failing. And therefore, if the unbreakable breaks, well, then maybe you can't really blame people when they try things and it doesn't work out. I essentially have two activities: companies I'm involved in and companies I invest in passively. The passive investment ratio of failure is reasonably high because I invest in very, very high risk, very early stage opportunities. It could be because I just can't get to Las Vegas often enough, I don't know. But it's what I do, and I choose it because I have a passion for the idea and or the entrepreneur. I consider failure, businesses fail, businesses succeed. This is the stuff of life. I don't fail. Business opportunities that I take on sometimes do. And I see it as being a perfectly clear distinction. If we took that view in sport, then every weekend a football team would fail. But they don't fail, they lose a game. We don't call it failure, we call it losing the game. What do they do next week? They dust themselves off and they go back on the field and play another game. I don't really get the notion that one's life is over when one game is over.